This is Brent Rains for Alternate Perceptions Online magazine. It's Wednesday evening, May the 24th, and I'm about to interview Robert Filocco of New Jersey, a psychotherapist who has also for many years also been interested in the phenomenon of unidentified flying objects and reports of abductions and such. And he's also been quite interested in the writings of people like Keel and Jacques, Vallee, and so that gives you an idea where we're headed here. And plus also Rudolf Steiner, an occultist who more than a century ago had ideas and thoughts on what laid ahead for us in the future that Robert finds quite relevant to today, that we see a lot of what he wrote about back then as shaping up, evolving into current times. What I'd like to do at present is to maybe start with that experience I heard you describing on Anthony Peake's show a while back, about how when you were about 8 or 9, for about 3 weeks, you had what you later realized were kind of like the typical alien being coming into your bedroom at night. And if you could just tell some about that, because that was really something that drew your, first at an early age, drew your notice of this, and then later on reading other literature on, alien abductions years later, it caused you to really start looking at that aspect.
When I was 8 or 9 years old, I believe I was 8 at the time. It was 1967, so kind of dates me a bit. For a period of about 3 weeks, I had repeated visitations. Nothing before that I remember, and nothing really after that of that type. Of what I later realized were mantid beings, which are one of the less common beings that you see in literature. And the experience was fairly typical, I guess. You could say it was a fairly normal experience, as normal as it can be, as far as the nature of it. There was definitely some sort of downloads that I noticed. But later on, I compared it to like microfiche going by very quickly, as if some information was being transmitted to me. I also had a vision of a nuclear war attack by China, a nuclear strike by China, which since then I've been kind of keeping track of, world events in terms of China's role, which obviously this is not so far-fetched at this point, unfortunately. Back in '67, I mean, Russia was, of course, the Cold War was still going on with Russia. They were our, so-called major enemy. Also had, some visuals of ecological disaster, which again is pretty common, in the literature. So I kind of, put all that together when Hopkins and Jacobs and some of the other folks started, doing their writings in the '80s, and it sort of made sense to me. But I always, for a period of time, I'd wondered about that. I started reading Keel when I was in middle school. And was fascinated by his work. Also, Anatomy of a Phenomena by Jacques Vallee was one of the first books I read on the topic. Mm-hmm. From the beginning, I believe that this was much more than just an extraterrestrial visitation, that there was something much more profound going on. I mean, why would some beings come into my room my bedroom when I was 7 years old and input this information or these visions? It's certainly not something that accords with the typical ET hypothesis. So that got me started being interested in the paranormal, UFOs, from a young age. I did some research on that in my late teens, early 20s. Did some research on mystical experiences, some psychological research on that when I was an undergrad. I actually did an independent study on UFOs, believe it or not, when I was 19 and 20. Like in 1980, I finished it. There was a wonderful old eccentric anthropologist, professor, Roger Westcott, who sponsored that. So I dived pretty deeply into research on the connection with UFOs and shamanism, the work of Julian Jaynes, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, the connection with that I saw with the Serious Mystery, and Robert Temple's book that came out at the same time. So I had a lot of fun with that. And then I kind of, went on with my life and training as a psychologist and having a family and all that. And back in the 90s, I started, getting back into reading the literature a bit more. I think I published a piece in the Bulletin of Anomalous Experience in 1994, which had a lot of the content of that was from my research, my independent study. It was a short piece, but I had a lot of fun with it. I mean, John Keel had a little reply to Androphil in that. It was just kind of cool to have something published, with John Keel also as part of one of the contributors. And then for a long time, again, I just was not, heavily researching the paranormal UFOs. I got back into it really in the last 10, 12 years. And part of that was reading Rudolf Steiner and seeing the connection between his cosmology and his description of elemental beings and, the UFO phenomena. So I've been writing some papers on that. I had a paper published August of 2020 in Outer Limits magazine, and I've extensively revised that and expanded that. And that's what's coming out in Alternate Perceptions, I think June 1st, you said?
Yes, June 1st. Yeah. Rudolf Steiner, UFOs and Ahriman, or however you pronounce that.
Ahriman.
Okay. That's one I haven't heard before. But a lot of other areas are familiar. Carl Jung, and you mentioned the psychoid, that term, which connects the matter with psychic or the psychological or whatever. Anyway, the Steiner was, and I hadn't really studied him a whole lot. The only thing I could, really remembered about him was theosophy, I think, involved in that background. And also he built these two large domed buildings. One was wood, burned down a couple of years later, and then another one that's still standing over in Austria, I think. But I always thought that this huge dome reminded me of kind of like George Van Tassel's building out there in California, in the desert that was supposed to have acoustical qualities and such. And I thought that was kind of interesting. But your article goes into a great deal of detail on Steiner's, the key points that kind of relate to the development of technology and how it's affecting us, and the spiritual elements of these experiences, which I know that back in 1971, as a teenager, I was asking Keel, what could I do? How would I become better informed and studying these things, maybe getting out the field like he did. And he recommended reading literature on apparitions and religious visionary experiences and things of that nature. So I thought, wow, this sounds like a big college thing here to delve into. Here I was just getting out of high school. But anyway, I guess if you could, just kind of share with us about that. And I know you mentioned religious type experiences, spiritual experiences, and it seems probably like that came about maybe in part from your experience with the Manded beings back as a 8 or 9 year old child in '67. I mean, it's quite common in a lot of alien abduction contactee accounts that there are also these, spiritual elements too. Do you think any of that's related, from your evolving thoughts on these things and where that may have affected you down the road? Or
yeah, I think that experience definitely influenced me from a pretty young age to study philosophy. again, I remember in elementary school, I came across a book on karma and reincarnation, and I thought this makes sense to me. I was always fascinated thinking about whether God existed from a very young age. So I kind of had that background to begin with. But those experiences did stand out for me. And I've always thought of the phenomena in terms of having a spiritual element. I think Steiner, connecting with Steiner's work on his cosmology, his outline of human evolution, ties in very, very well with that. I think that I think the UFO phenomenon is an important part of the spiritual evolution of humanity, and I think that there are, at least vis-a-vis human beings, benign and malevolent elements to it. And that's obviously not entirely a new theory. Creighton wrote about it. Druffel wrote about jinn beings, and Strieber has written about the connection with the elemental world. But Steiner really gives. Steiner was a student of the occult, as well as a philosopher, and trained in the science of his day. He was very much a polymath. So he provides a framework rather than just speculation, a coherent framework from the Rosicrucian tradition about who these beings are. And some of them he describes. It's interesting because he mentions the Pleiades as a source of some of them, which is a major. I think you're aware of that. Pleiades, Orion, Sirius, they come up constantly. Arcturus, certain star systems come up constantly in the abduction literature. And he mentions that there are advanced beings from what he describes as Venus and Vulcan. And those aren't necessarily the planet Venus, the physical planet Venus, but they're realms that are here to help humanity. So I think in terms like Mary Rodwell's work and some other people who are emphasizing more of the positive elements of the phenomena and teaching us, bringing us along, helping us develop, healing abilities, telepathic abilities, psychic abilities. I think there's something to that. And there's certainly a malevolent component to it in terms of abductions and the forced sexual intercourse. I speculate in my paper that Steiner talked about dark angels or fallen angels, which are part of his cosmology, continuing human reproduction beyond the time it was intended. And I speculate in my paper that part of the UFO abduction phenomenon, more the malevolent aspect, I suppose, is creating a kind of gene pool, perpetuating human physical reproduction. Steiner believed we were evolving away from the physical world, so we would become completely spiritual beings without illness, with a much more subtle physical body, and that's being hindered by other spiritual forces, such as Ahriman. Ahriman is the Persian in the Zoroastrian system. He was Satan. So you have Lucifer and you have Satan, are two major figures, and Steiner talks a lot about Luciferic and Ahrimanic intelligences, but he also believed that there were actual beings called Ahriman and Lucifer, much like Christ, and Christ was sort of the balancing force between those two, which Gurdjieff also talked about that too, in a somewhat different way, but it's part of a lot of occult literature from that late 19th, early 20th century. Gets into Ahrimanic and Luciferic forces, but Steiner in particular he's to me at least, he's very easy to read. He's not as opaque. There's not as much obfuscation or hide and seek kind of searching in terms of his meaning. I've read a lot of Gurdjieff and studied his system a bit, and I respect it, but he was much more of a character than Steiner. Steiner seems to have started the anthroposophical movement, which grew out of theosophy, in the belief that it was potentially a very powerful force in creating a much more benign direction for human evolution. So that's I guess that's a long-winded response to your question. I hope, yeah.
Yeah, Gurdjieff, I tried to read one of his books one time, and it was I remember talking about the tri-union brain, but it kind of lost me in a lot of different areas there. It was hard to figure out just what he was writing about, but I had seen him mentioned, so I thought I'd grab a book and that he had written and kind of gain some insight. I know that I think it was Robert Anton Wilson's Cosmic Trigger years ago, back in the 70s, was a book that talked about Sirius and Robert Temple and all these various occult aspects that he was delving into, and it was quite a mind-boggling thing for someone that just been immersed mainly in the UFO phenomena. If you get into all the occult areas, and there's a book. What is it? The Gods of Eden, that deals with, I think, a lot of elements that you touched upon. The whole spiritual dynamics and the deceptive elements and matter versus spirit and so on. I can't remember what the name of the author was, but I've
it's Brawley, I think, wasn't it?
Yes,
Brawley.
Bramley. Now just had the first name, but anyway, yeah. And it seemed like that was a very well-researched book. I remember he was someone who had, I think, written a lot of material in years past for military magazines and such, and he thought he would write one on UFOs, and discovered that there were a lot of elements that seemed like they were almost like psychological warfare type things. They were just deceptive and using the veil of religion or whatever to kind of mislead people at times. And he dealt with a lot of historical accounts going back centuries. So I remember one time where he was writing about the plague, and he was writing about how just before a village was hit by the plague, that there would be these figures, robed figures outside of these communities, and they would have like something long that they were kind of sweeping the weed or something outside of a community just before a plague hit. And I thought, well, that's unusual. That's kind of interesting. I hadn't heard that before, but anyway, and so. Are there some of your spiritual experiences you had? Were they things that you think were maybe connected with, evolved from your early experience with the Mandids, and is interrelated with all of this in some way? Or
I'm guessing so. I've had a variety of kinds of experiences, mostly positive. So mystical experiences of connection, union, a deep sense of well-being. I did have a possession experience, which was obviously on the opposite end of the spectrum. I actually was reading The Center of the Cyclone by John Lilly, and actually ironically, while I was reading that, I had an experience with a friend where something told me to look into his eyes, and he looked into mine, and we had this moment where there was a light around me. So how he explains it, and I had this vision of a past life with him, and so it was very strange. We couldn't really look at each other for a couple of days after that, and then I was reading in The Center of the Cyclone that's called the Sufi eye exercise. So I started doing that with people. So if you look into each other's eyes for an extended period of time, you start to see faces change, and I did that with a number of different close friends, and they would see the same faces. They would describe exactly the same faces. So I thought this is pretty interesting. But I did have one experience where doing that, where some other being came through, and my face changed to something pretty hideous. And for a while, I lost a sense of myself. I had to repeat my name. Did a little prayer, and after about an hour or two, I came out of it. But it was pretty horrifying. So that's probably the only experience that I had of sort of the darker side of this. I've had a lot of prophetic dreams, which I think are they're kind of a byproduct of any kind of work you're doing on yourself. I mean, I don't think those are unusual, but they sort of reinforce the idea that there's, we're connected to, other sources of information and knowledge, intelligence. So yeah, I see that as I see them as all interconnected. Maybe that experience with mantid beings certainly opened me up to that, possibly. I don't have recall. I have some conscious recall of it for sure, but I don't have a complete recall. And I haven't, I'm a little remiss, I guess, being a researcher, but I haven't completely explored that myself through hypnosis or any form of inquiry, other than I did with a colleague, I did EMDR, which is a trauma technique. And I kind of hit a wall, which again is classic in the literature. Sometimes you hit a wall and you're prevented from going forward with disclosing whatever it is. And that's the first time I ever had that experience. And it was very, it was very anxiety provoking. So we just said, let's leave it alone for now. So maybe there's some other hidden, information in there that they were downloading that hasn't come out yet. I have no idea, but it's a pretty profound experience when you're, 8 years old. I was 8 then. I was 67, so I was 8.5 years old at that point. But I could definitely see them as being interconnected in some way. The different experiences I've had.
Well, with those the beings in 67 was for 3 weeks. Was it a nightly thing that they would come into your bedroom, and was there usually more than one, or
there was a leader, and there was some other figures that were behind him, but there was one in particular that I have a real strong visual recall of, and it was a classic mantid being with the brown cape, with the brown clothing. Looked like it was insectoid. I mean, the closest I would describe it as kind of a tall mantid. So that happened. That was repeatedly every night. Prior to that, I was never scared of the dark. I was never afraid of much of anything. And afterwards, after those 3 weeks, I don't remember. I'm not consciously aware of any other contact, which is also probably not the typical pattern. Usually there's some sort of follow-up or later visitations or abductions or whatever. And I don't think I was abducted. I don't remember being taken aboard a craft or being taken out of my room. I mean, it's possible because I haven't fully explored it. But I just remember them. It really was more of a telepathic kind of inputting of some sort of information. As I mentioned, it felt kind of like a microfiche. I remember telling them, slow down, this is going too fast, which is also something a few abductees report, that whatever that level of input is, it's too much for our conscious minds to absorb. There's a couple of people in Max studies who mentioned that it was this rapid download, and they also remember saying, slow down, this is going too fast. So there's a lot of parallels there with the abduction literature.
Yeah, was there that's common too, the fact that there's one that stands out as the leader, and you mentioned being tall. He was taller than the others in the group, or
it seems that way from my memory. It could be because they were just further back. They were not, they weren't as close to me. It's hard to say, but there weren't any grays or any other beings. It was just definitely mantid beings. I mean, the grays. When the grays first came out, I was saying, this sounds like what I experienced, but I don't remember seeing grays. I remember seeing these insect-like beings. And then a little bit later, people started talking about the mantid beings, which is not as common, but it's certainly well known. And then I sort of put it together. Aha, that's what I was seeing. That's who was visiting me.
And about how tall were they? Because I realized you were 8 or 9 at the time, but did you have any? Were they adult size, or?
They were definitely adult size. They were, probably around 6 foot. I would estimate, based on my, I was in bed, so I was lying flat first of all. But based on looking at the outline of the room that I was in, my bedroom, I would say they were Yeah, at least 6 foot tall. They were tall beings.
Okay. Was there a certain number usually, or just where you could just mainly see the one in front? And um,
It's usually 2 or 3. What visual snapshots I have, there was one that was in front, and there was usually 2 or 3 people. I suspect I probably just have remember maybe 5 or 10%, if that, of what really transpired. Is more the sort of the psychic experience of what was going on, what they were inputting. That's what stands out for me. So like watching it almost like a TV set, some visual image. What was really horrifying was the nuclear attack, and that was clearly, they were telling me China was going to attack. So I hope that doesn't happen, obviously, but that was pretty horrifying. The only experience I've had since then that was similar was a couple of times when I had a high fever, like a flu. I had that return, that horrible, terrible, that terrifying feeling return. It wasn't connected to a specific kind of event, but there's a couple of times where I felt that kind of horror again. So perhaps something was going on then that I don't remember. I don't know. I did one time come down when I had a high fever, and I was speaking according to my mother, I was speaking in a strange language that she didn't recognize. And it wasn't, it wasn't a European language. It wasn't obviously English. And she couldn't remember the specifics, but she was sort of shocked that I was speaking this odd language and trying to communicate. And then I sort of snapped out of it and came back to myself. So that was a pretty weird experience as well. But since then, maybe I was a teenager then. Since then, I haven't had anything, quite like that. Again, I've had prophetic dreams. I've had some like numinous, big dreams, as Jung would call them. I wrote a children's book about one experience of sort of this Celtic figure that appeared in a dream. Is very powerful, very beautiful, very benign. I wrote a children's book about that. That definitely stands out. For a period of time, and this is interesting. It kind of connects with Steiner as well. I was feeling some sort of connection with the sun, and there's literature. The philosophers have talked about that. Marcus Aurelius talked about how he would go into ecstasy, looking at the sun. And the sun is a powerful, according to Steiner and Rosicrucian tradition, other occult traditions, is a powerful transmitter of spiritual knowledge, of not just information, but a kind of wisdom, or kind of a benign protective, as a benign protective aspect. And there was many years where I just felt, I would look at the sun and I would feel this sense of well-being, bordering on ecstasy a few times, kind of a very static feeling. And Steiner talks about that as part of the initiation process. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I still feel that way, but not quite to the same degree. I can connect with that if I want to, but it was more intrusive for a while. Not intrusive in a bad way, but it was something that my attention was pulled to it.
Was there a certain time that these visits, did you notice that they would seem to occur, or was it just
Well, I wasn't keeping track of it then, obviously. It was definitely nighttime, so this was in the winter. It was December into January, so obviously the sun went down pretty early. So I couldn't tell you. I would guess probably like 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock I would go to bed. There was one night where I went to bed and they were already there. They were kind of waiting for me, and they seemed shocked that I could see them. And I just ran downstairs and told my mother, and of course she thought it was, some sort of nightmare. That was one episode that stands out pretty clearly. So I had to go trudge back up to bed and pretend that nothing was happening, but they certainly were there. But I remember this almost like a shocked expression on their face that I could see them.
And did they just usually just appear, or did you actually see them into the room at any time, or exit the room, or?
No, I never saw it like go through a wall or anything like that. They just seemed to be there, or I'd fall asleep and then I would have this nightmarish kind of activity, or I get a download, I guess you could call it now. So I was already asleep, so I couldn't tell you exactly when it happened. But I do know, I mean, I'm sure I wasn't going to bed at 3 in the morning. I was probably going to bed maybe 9 or 10 o'clock at the latest, and they were already kind of waiting for me that one time. And that was probably the most terrifying part of it, because I had no clue who they were or what the hell was going on. I just knew it wasn't just in my mind. I never believed that, or I knew it wasn't a nightmare because some of it was conscious.
Yeah.
I was not, it wasn't just in a sleep state.
That's intriguing. I know that now was about electronics and artificial intelligence that, I know there's a lot of talk these days about artificial intelligence concern that it's going to, we need to slow down and study this some more, that, that this could be a bad thing. And Steiner actually indicated in his early writings that indicated that he was aware of what was coming ahead with electronics and computers and such, even though that was way before. Even though that was way before, anybody would think about something like that.
True. That's one very intriguing thing about Steiner, is he was very prescient about the present time, which makes me take his body of work more seriously, because around the turn of the 19th century into 18th into the 19th century, and through the teens and into the 20s, he died in 25. He talked about how a machine-man merger was inevitable, and that Ahriman was really behind that. So you kind of have to understand his whole cosmology. There is, and I'm going to simplify it, but there are spiritual realms where there are 4 ethers, life and chemical and heat ethers. That's the primary structure of the universe. The physical world that we live in now, that's dominated by electromagnetics, is a subworld, a subnature for him. It was sort of created when matter was created. Electricity and electromagnetism were created, but those are the realms of the sub-nature beings like Ahriman. So he from, again, over 100 years ago, is talking about the negative effects of electricity and electronics on the human body, which we now have plenty of scientific evidence for that. You have The Invisible Rainbow by Furstenberg, you have Robert Becker's work, and so forth. We know 5G is there's plenty of scientific evidence that there's dangers there. So he was talking about this and its negative effects on nature and the human body a long time ago. And this is connected to the Ahrimanic agenda, which is to create artificial intelligence to force or guide human beings into another sphere, which is sort of a bogus sphere that was carved out of creation by these beings of hindrance. It's called the 8th sphere. There's a lot of interest now in the 8th sphere, it first surfaced with Steiner, Blavatsky, and a few occultists late 19th, early 20th century. Originally, one occultist, Sinnett, ascribed it to the moon, but that was an incorrect. That was actually incorrect. It's not literally the moon sphere, our moon. It harkens back to an older form of pictorial intelligence, like almost 2-dimensional world, like a virtual reality. This is the consciousness, this is the sphere that Ahriman wants to take human beings into. So it's pretty fascinating. Now we're talking about artificial intelligence. We're talking about having avatars, linking up downloading our consciousness into a computer, and leaving our physical bodies behind. And this is exactly what Steiner warned against, that this is not a benign thing. This is the machinations of particularly Ahriman, who he claimed would incarnate in a physical body in the third millennium. And most indications are that it's early in the third millennium, it's early this century. So there's a lot of speculation amongst anthroposophists, and I'm actually writing a paper on this now, kind of speculating about the physical incarnation of this being, much like Christ incarnated, according to Steiner. Lucifer incarnated 2000 BC in China, was one of the early emperors who helped their civilization develop. Lucifer and Ahriman are very different beings. Lucifer was originally a being of light who turned against God. It's sort of the classic. In some ways, Steiner has a classic metaphysics in that regard, but Lucifer became a very vain, self-centered being who wanted to kind of rule his own universe, and he took some other beings with him. So the fallen angels, that's part of the whole Steiner cosmology, and he's kind of a vain character who's interested in creating a kind of ungrounded spirituality, kind of a grandiose view of intelligence, whereas Ahriman is much more of an analytical, dry intelligence, very emotionless, very humorless, almost kind of sclerotic in his thinking, and he's much more interested in power and control. So he wants to control human consciousness. He wants to draw people into this sphere so he can sort of dominate to their souls. So the backdrop of this is a battle for human souls, and that's been touched on in the UFO literature as this could be part of that this whole kind of backdrop is much more than just technology or ETs. It ties in with human evolution. Cutchin's work is really interesting. Joshua Cutchin, I'm sure. Yeah. His emphasis on the possibility or the connection with death and dying, and the idea that there's this migration of different souls and some the UFO entities, intelligences seem to be very interested in scenes of disaster where they seem to, there's accounts where they seem to draw up the souls of dead people. Keel talked about this. Their tendency to visit graveyards and disaster sites and things of that nature. There seems to be kind of a battle over human souls, and part of that battle is guiding the souls after death. Like, where do they go? And this is kind of simplifying things quite a bit, but I think Cutchin's work kind of is very compatible with some things that Steiner talked about. Cutchin talks about doppelgangers in that book, which is fascinating to me. And Brad Steiger was someone obviously you knew very well, and he claimed that there was a doppelganger, a double that was going around giving lectures and was the personality was completely different from him, and he had no idea this being was whoever that was. His double was doing that. Strieber talks about that, and Steiner talks about the existence of an Ahrimanic double that connects to our body and it kind of regulates our nervous system to electromagnetism when we're born. And those beings are trying to cross over when we die. They're trying to reach into the eternal realms and sort of capture souls. It sounds very bizarre, I guess, to the modern mind, but it's pretty intriguing to me that Cutchin's talking about doppelgangers, and Steiner predicted that people would experience towards the end of the century, in the last century, and early this century, they would experience this phenomena of seeing their double, and this was according to him, was the Ahrimanic double. So that's just another kind of intriguing element in that found in the UFO literature that lines up with Steiner's work. And I'm working on a paper on that, and I'm working on a paper on the Ahrimanic incarnation.
Yeah, Joshua Cutchin also writes about people who had encounters, and Keel touched upon this too, with UFOs, and besides the alien beings, there were like relatives of, you know,
Yes.
that being
Yes.
passed on
Yeah.
with the aliens, you know. And kind of reminded me of that TV show a few decades back. This what is it? American Hero or something. The guy was um, let's see, he encountered a UFO and a car radio started, you know, making a communication by going back and forth across the dial and finding the right words to communicate out of these different radio stations, you know. And then there was an FBI guy with him in the car, and this guy came out who was a former friend but who had died, came out of the UFO and you know, communicated they would work together, I think. And while this flying saucer is hovering nearby, and he's given a suit with instructions, the young guy with him, to go ahead and put this like, well, you know, a costume like Superman, and he can fly and all this. Except he, on the way home, he dropped the instruction thing, so he's the instructions he had, and he's kind of just trying to figure out. It's kind of a comedy, but at the same time, it's like, man, you know, that whole scene there was so much like some of the UFO cases that really the mainstream nuts and bolts people don't really talk about it, you know. But there it is.
I'm
And
glad you mentioned that aspect of seeing, you know, our relatives who passed on. I mean, that's something that Keel talked about, right? And of course he was criticized, and that was sort of like the you know, you have the government cover up, but then you have the researchers themselves covering up things that were too bizarre. But he was one of the first ones to really address that, and you know, Cutchin gets into a lot of that. That, you know, if these are ET beings, they're not. Why would they have my Uncle Sal, you know, come out of it and have a conversation with me? You know, it doesn't make any sense. But spiritually, it makes sense. And Steiner talked about how, again, not only would we be seeing more into the elemental realms, not only would there be more gifted psychic people being born, not only would we be seeing doppelgangers, but the connection with the dead, our dead relatives, has become much more powerful and important in the last 100 years or so, as part of our kind of aiding each other. Now, Cutchin in one passage speculates: are they harvesting us or are they guiding us? And I think both are true. I think that there are beings that are instrumental in helping us contact our dead relatives and maintain that connection. And I think that there's also a harvesting of souls going on too. I think you have you know, very malevolent aspects of, you know, the abduction phenomena that resemble, you know, the MK Ultra. They resemble a lot of the terrible things that humans have done to each other, as far as torture and brainwashing and things of that nature. Which, you know, I can't. Some people sort of try to twist that into something positive. That is sort of a shamanic initiation experience, things of that nature. I think there's some validity to that, but some of it seems outright malevolent to me. So
yeah, it's hard to really, you know. I see a lot of people jump to conclusions. Well, I was contacted by this being, and I believe they're good. You know, it's just, you know, that they seem friendly and all, but you really, it's like, how do you know? You know, if the information they give you doesn't check out, that's one thing always to look for. You know, and how it all presents itself. Um, I, you know, because I started corresponding with John Keel back in 1969. He had more influence on me, so, you know, eventually I wrote a book on John Keel. But I really felt like he had a lot of good ideas of how to approach this and what it was about, which he seemed to gather rather quickly. And I think that was because, you know, he'd had these experiences as a young man, like age 7, seeing a ball of light with his stepfather and his mother while they were out riding through the country, and this big ball of light the size of a barn rose up from a hilltop, and then it just took off real fast. And when he was 10 years old, you know, he lived in a farming community, and a lot of the farmers had reported seeing like a gorilla running across road, at night, and they got their guns out. And then as soon as it started, it was all over. But once he put all these pieces together, the strange lights, the grill, the also in the farmhouse, these in his bedroom there was knocking on the walls. He tried to communicate with it, and it was kind of like a poltergeist thing. And when he was, I think, about 19, living in New York City, he had one of those experiences where suddenly, in the night, laying in bed, he had the answers to everything. I think there was sort of a light in the room, and it was like a cosmic consciousness peak experience. And by the time he was like a download. By the time he woke up the next day, though, he could only remember little bits and pieces. But as it was happening, he thought, "I've got it. I got the answer to it all." And so I think, he started out 66 as nuts and bolts. When he decided to check it out, traveled around and realized there were a lot of elements that, were not just nuts and bolts. And it was also things that he could kind of, I'm sure, reflect back on in his early years and say, "Oh, I've had something similar," and then piece it together the way he did. But when I was, he passed away July 3rd of 2009 in New York City at, I think he was 79. And I thought, what a loss to ufology. And then in March of the following year, I was with some people doing paranormal investigations, visiting haunted sites or whatever. And one of them I found out was an abductee, and he was working with the ghost box, where you take a Radio Shack digital radio, AM, FM, and fix it where it goes on continuous scan, and in between and the white noise, you pick up voices. I was skeptical of that, but this one night and it was in March of 2010. I secretly decided I wanted to hear John Keel. And what happened is I didn't pick up on it right off, and we did about an hour recording. But later on, I was reviewing the audio, months later, actually, and there was a point where my wife's brother was given an opportunity to speak just before they wound it up toward the last of the session. And instead of hearing her brother's name, it was Keel, Johnny. And, and the reason I still had that recording was because in times following that, we were on investigation the following May, which I wasn't aware of what was on the tape in March. I didn't hear it in real time. We were at this site, and we were having quite a bit of activity. And Brett Oldham, who was the guy who introduced me to the ghost box and who was actually an alien abductee from going back to age 5, he said, "I heard John Keel." And then later on, there's John Keel again. And I'm like, what? I want to. So I had him play it back. He made a recording, and it was John Keel. So then on the anniversary of his passing, July 3rd, 2010, we were at home of a Sandy Nichols in Thompson Station, south of Nashville. And there was me and my wife, Brett Oldham, his wife then, Gina, and Sandy Nichols. And we were doing a session. We had about 3 recorders and one ghost box hooked up to 2 big stereo speakers where we had to yell in order to be heard ourselves. You can hear in one, I said, I'd like to try to contact John Keel. He passed away exactly a year ago. And this was the night that I realized, okay, this is for real. There's no one out in the bush that I don't think that's transmitting on a transmitter, playing games with me here. Brett asked, can John Keel say his name? And like within a second or two, you hear a male voice saying John Keel. And he had seen Bigfoot, he said, back in Ohio when he was a teenager. And so he's always been interested in cryptids. And he says, John Keel, what can you tell us about Bigfoot? And this voice says, Smuck Bigfoot, see? And then there was like two other voices said, see. And I asked about the his book Jadu. I says, what can you tell us about Jadu? Because I didn't think Sandy or Brett knew anything really about that part of John Keel. They just knew generally John Keel was interested in UFOs and cryptids and things. So lo and behold, the voice says, Jadu, eh? And we're like, huh? And someone says, is that what he said, Jadu? And he says, yeah. And I'm thinking, well, I got to strike while the iron's hot. So I says, yes, what can you tell us about Jadu? And this voice says, into the fire. And then it just kind of goes rambling on. And then it comes back and it sounds like, teach me outside. And I was thinking, if this is anything John Keel related, he knew that Jadu was in the East, it would have been like black magic. And into the fire, well, that could be symbolic there. Teach me outside. Well, Keel was someone who was always reading, kept up with all kinds of different kinds of literature from an early age. But he also sought adventures. He didn't, just like to just read. He liked to go to, out and meet people and get their stories. And of course, that's what Jadu is about, where he traveled from Egypt to Singapore and through all those different countries and had the experiences that he had. So I got a box myself, a ghost box, as you call it. My son-in-law fixed it up, and I was getting the same things here at the house with myself, my wife, my daughter. And one time it was John Keel Brent, Bert here. And Bert was I identify with being Bert Swartz, who had died back in September 2010, who I've been corresponding with for about 37 years. I've met him twice, and we had an extensive correspondence. A psychiatrist who wrote a lot of articles for Flying Saucer View, but he got into the UFO thing really deep because of John Keel. Contacted him after he was discussed and interviewed by, the Chicago newsman years ago, popular on the radio, Paul Harvey, yeah. And so, that he'd written for a medical journal 4 cases of people that he had interviewed. He was really into parapsychology, but these 4 cases came up. He wrote it for a medical journal, and that was going to be his swan song. After that, he was going to go back to psychiatry and just the paranormal. But John Keel got wind of what he wrote and contacted him and said, we need you in the UFO field, your background and the relevance of psychic phenomena to UFOs. So he introduced him to Charles Bowen, who was then the editor of Flying Saucer View, and some other people in the UFO field. And that's how he became involved. So anyway, it was just interesting to think about the electronics. I mean, I've had these interactive, intelligent responses, and for some, they're good. I haven't really had anything bad happen, but it's like I was very involved in doing all these sessions for about 4 years, and I thought, really, it's not telling me anything. It's not really educating me anymore about the phenomena itself. It's always just sort of playing these almost like it's interactive and intelligence, but it's not telling me anything specific about the nature of the phenomena, which is what I'm after. I mean, I even got when I ask who was there to help out with a session, I will get Bishop, who was actually Brett's guide, and have got some, but it sounds, it's interesting. The Keel talked about the electromagnetic spectrum, manipulation of the energies, and he even describes in one of his books, like a psychic medium. There was a friend of his who had recorded a psychic medium of someone he knew, and he said the voice was exactly the same, and the things he said, I mean, it sounded just like him. So this guy believed him, but Keel didn't believe this. This is where the elementals or whatever were, the ultra-terrestrials, as he called them. They could imitate anybody, and they could come up with accurate information and make you think it was really the person you were talking with. So I've done these. I still do some sessions out of curiosity, but I don't know who I'm dealing with exactly. It's when we do the session, we always say ask for only that which is for our highest good to come through. And sometimes we detect things that aren't supposed to come out on an AM radio, frequency, cuss words. So anyhow, when you talk about electronics and artificial intelligence, it's like you can get these things through telephones or radios, AM, FM, that are quite anomalous, so I've rambled on a bit much there, but
I love the John Keel stories. Again, I'm a fan as well. I'm looking forward to reading your book on Keel. That's one I haven't read yet. But the whole the manipulation of the electromagnetic spectrum is what Steiner talked about. That it comes from the Ahrimanic forces, and not to trust what they have to say. He was a very deep skeptic of spiritualism. He believed that it was. There's a whole backstory to that as far as secret societies being involved in that and kind of setting that up. But he's very skeptical of most content that comes through from that realm. He believes that much of it comes from the eighth sphere, which I talked about, and these beings who are, they have the trickster element to them, but they're also often trying to manipulate us and play games with us. You have the Joe Fisher story, and a lot of really bad outcomes when people believe in the content that's coming through. Now, is some of that from benign forces, from higher spiritual forces? I think so. I think it's the minority, unfortunately. If you read like Wilson Van Dusen's work, who is a psychiatrist who is a scholar of the Swedenborgian tradition, he talks about his work with psychotic patients and how probably 80% of their voices seem to be accusatory, persecutory, negative, but there are some elements where higher beings seem to come through. This is also what Swedenborg said, that the majority of what you're going to get out there is that you can't trust that these are beings that will lie. You have the shamanic tradition with Michael Harner, who talked about the same thing, his initial experience of these beings who claimed they were lords of the universe or whatever, and the shaman told them, they always say that. They're just playing with you. So you really have to be very careful with this stuff. It's interesting to me, again, connecting it to Ahriman. I mean, Steiner believed that at one point human beings were clairvoyant. We had a direct connection to the spiritual realm, but we had to over time develop our own ego, our own sense of independence, almost like a Julian Jaynes kind of scenario, where we were hearing the voices of the gods. The gods were kind of controlling us, and now we're developing our own identity. That's part of human evolution. But in that process, we become more immersed in materialism, more immersed in separation and ego. So it's sort of a valley that we're in terms of our development. And now we have to sort of emerge from that and develop more of a sense of connection and community, empathy. He predicted that if human evolution goes in the right direction, we would be a culture of empaths, that everyone would be able to sense other people's feelings. That no one, I think there's a quote where no one would be able to go to bed at night if someone somewhere was suffering. It would be this kind of group mind, but of not an automatic hive mind like artificial intelligence, which is almost the exact opposite of what Steiner believed human evolution was destined to go towards. If it's guided by the right forces. But we have choice. We have free will. We can get immersed in artificial intelligence, believe that there's no spiritual world, that everything is made of matter. that meditation and prayer and things like that are of no use, or we can go on some sort of spiritual path. And his anthroposophy was not just about abstract information. He was a clairvoyant himself, and claimed he was a clairvoyant. And books like How to Know Higher Worlds are his guide towards developing those supersensory abilities. So he is a pretty interesting figure. He was talking about, just like Gurdjieff was talking about hemispheric differences over 100 years ago, he's talking about the enteric brain and the role of nutrition in terms of neural development and the importance of food, and how it was important that our food be pure. So if you were around now seeing GMO crops and all the poisons in our environment, he would, I know he would see that as part of the whole effort to derail humanity into sort of a false path, an artificial intelligence that, so the pictorial virtual world is the world that Ahriman lives in. That's what he's trying to draw us into. So it's interesting that, just in the last couple of weeks since we connected, I think I sent these to you. There's a movie coming out called Ahriman, Dying Before Death. And the mother of Elon Musk's two children has a cameo role in that. So there's this movie about Ahriman coming out. There's this clip in Kong versus Godzilla where there's just this clip where you see this book called, one of Steiner's books, The Incarnation of Ahriman, is on a desk with a bunch of other papers and things. So it's very strange that these things are starting to come out. I mean, if you're a bit of a conspiracy theorist and you believe in predictive programming, it seems like they're, again, kind of telling us what's going on without necessarily telling us. I don't know. I think there's a lot of, just like with the New Age movement, there's a lot of nonsense in the conspiracy world, but there's some validity to it as well. So I just went off a little on my own little sidebar there. So your turn.
That's good. It's very, very difficult to get people to really look a lot of times at this subject, because what they see and hear, they think, oh, this sounds too metaphysical mumbo jumbo, I mean, it's but when you get into it, really look at all the different moving parts, all the different components, it's you really have to kind of wonder just what is going on, and try to look at the bigger picture where humanity is. Right now, certainly social media has proven a lot of ways it's got its benefits, like for us to be able to talk like we are and discuss these things, but there's a lot of toxic situations that arise, with people that we didn't have before, I mean, and it's pretty disturbing, actually. And people have, I don't know, they get on social media and they say things that are hurtful, and that normally, we were a little more reserved. Now, I guess because it's an electronic box, you feel like, okay, well, no one can touch me here.
Mm-hmm.
And, yeah, it's
like any technology, it has its its positives and its negatives. I mean, DuPont invented dynamite because they thought it would help humanity. He didn't think they would make artillery shells out of it. And we go on and on about that. Steiner was not anti-technology. He believed that part of our evolution was to merge with machines, but in a way where we maintained our consciousness, where we would get machines to work with us, just with our minds. It kind of harkens back to Keely's machines, John Keel, late 19th century. And he believed at some point we would develop those technologies, but it would be harnessing them for the good of humanity, not losing our consciousness and merging with the machine, downloading our memories and our into some sort of computer system. That would just entrap us, and we would lose our we lose our empathic connection. We just become this automatic hive mind, kind of like the Borg in Star Trek. That's really what Steiner was worried about happening. That's kind of what the eighth sphere is like, except it's not just electronic machines. It's a whole weird variety of beings. If you look like Skinwalker Ranch or other portals, you see, Bigfoot come through. You see these weird cryptid creatures come through. You see UFOs. You see poltergeist phenomena. The paranormal and UFOs are very much interconnected, and these are portals into the eighth sphere. I feel. Again, if Steiner were alive today, he was watching Skinwalker Ranch on TV. He'd probably say that's coming from the eighth sphere.
Yeah, when you talk about the eighth sphere, that reminds me of Keel's book, The Eighth Tower. And
yes, yeah,
and
the super spectrum.
Yeah, he delved quite deeply into the super spectrum and his theories and all of that. And anyway, and there was something I was just thinking of, and just before that, anyway, it's kind of. Oh yeah, you were talking about Keeley there, and his work on these the technologies that nobody really knows exactly how he did what he did, but I remember John Keel wrote, I think, an introduction to that book, which I thought was quite interesting. That he would take the time to do that. But anyway, generally these interviews last about an hour, so I've got you on here for an hour and 6 minutes right now.
You can keep going if you want. I'm up for it. That's your call.
All righty. Well, at present, I know you said you're working on another article. Have you considered writing a book, or are you doing any more talk at a conference or anything coming up?
Yeah, I'd love to talk at a conference. I actually did speak. Well, I did a Zoom conference with an anthroposophical connected group called MizTech out in Seattle. That's the only conference I've done thus far. Yeah, I'm just, as I mentioned to you, I'm just kind of getting to know people in the UFO community, on connecting on a personal basis like we are now. So yeah, I plan on continuing to write papers on different topics. Maybe I could put them together in terms of like a book of articles, essays. I don't have a particular unifying theme where I could kind of pull all my diverse research together, at least not right now. But I'm quite content with getting some articles out there. So, appreciate your publishing that in alternate perceptions.
Well, it looked very interesting, and we're always looking for alternative views on these things, because there's a lot of room to explore different areas that often are neglected by the mainstream.
I agree. Again, Keel was a pioneer in all that. I think he and Vallee are still my favorite writers. As far as classic writers, I mean, J. Allen Hynek was interesting too, and I'll just add this: Hynek was a reader of Steiner. When Vallee, this is in Vallee's journals. When he inherited Hynek's library, he found books written by Steiner that were carefully annotated. Hynek was a reader in the Rosicrucian tradition, and especially liked Steiner's work and thought it was relevant to the UFO phenomena, but he couldn't write about it. I mean, he was in enough hot water just researching UFOs to begin with, never mind connecting it to some occult tradition, some crazy German philosopher. So that's an interesting kind of connection between Steiner and UFOs. Hynek was follower.
I was actually out there back when I went into the Navy in 1972. I was right there, Great Lakes Naval Training Academy was right outside Chicago. And I would take this train going into Chicago, and it would go right through Evanston. So I would stop, go to a payphone, look his number up. There he was, call him up, I'd like to meet with you, and he put me off several times. He finally says, my book, The UFO Experience, just came out. If you get a copy, read it. We'll come up with a time to, you come by and we'll talk. And so I got, the hardcover edition that was available at the time, and I took it with me, got his autograph. I got it over here on the shelf. And so we talked for a little while, about half hour, I guess. And we talked about he was interested in the Yakima Indian Reservation out there in Washington State, and those reports. I mentioned John Keel, and I was rather surprised when he said, "Yeah, I find his ideas and his writings interesting." He had a colleague who was a photo expert. I now read who was from the University of Chicago, who helped him in analyzing photos and things. We never really said much of anything. He just sort of stayed in the background. It was just mainly me and Dr. Hynek conversing back and forth. But yeah, I've talked to some other people that talked with him one on one, and there was one lady, she met him at a conference, and she talked about, she believed they were interdimensional, and he says, yeah, I'm leaning more and more in that direction, but I have to be cautious, what I say, because
Yeah.
you know it's not
Yeah,
something.
there was a lot of responsibility on him and Vallee to craft, especially the earlier books, not get into too much trouble with academia. They had their academic reputations to protect. I mean, Keel didn't have to worry about that so much, so Keel could be, a little bit more freewheeling. But I would love to get a hold of some of Hynek's Steiner books and see what he wrote, what his annotations were, what some of his notes were. But he clearly was thinking along those lines, that these are interdimensional beings, that this is connected to, a spiritual development of mankind. He died very young too, relatively speaking. It's too bad that he wasn't able to continue his work as well.
Yeah, he came in with Halley's Comet, and he left with Halley's Comet.
Yeah,
I had read that he was very sick at one point in his childhood, and he was bedridden, and had to. And that's when he took up an interest in Rosicrucian literature and such, and when some people in the UFO community found that out, it was a kind of a big hoopla over that. Some skeptics were saying, "Oh, so he really wasn't as big a skeptic as we thought all these years," But it was interesting to read, like, their thoughts, him and Vallee, and The Edge of Reality, that came out in 1965, and how really to find out that until 1963, and Vallee started telling him about the French wave of 1954 and all the elements, the high strangeness, a lot of those reports, and Hynek, like, he'd been working with the Air Force, and so he only knew the cases he was dealt a hand to study, and when it came to landings, well, they were always assumed that was teenage boys who were pouring gasoline somewhere on the ground, making circles and such, and they were no better than NICAP, National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, with Major Donald Keel was director, because he didn't like anything to do with beings associated with the craft. That was that to him was like George Adamski and Howard Menger and them. It was nonsense, So they just wanted craft, and as Jim Moseley said, if it came down and landed and a being got out, that was it. They buried the story,
Yeah.
And so they were no better than the Air Force that they were,
Yeah, it's
about.
So Vallee it was Vallee who, or maybe it was Keel, who talked about, like, the second cover up. The UFO researchers have covered up much more than the government has, just by censoring things that didn't fit into their theories.
Yeah, and Cora Lorenzen of APRO, to her credit, dealt with some issues that were very controversial back in those days. Even the reports from South America of these little hairy beings with tremendous strength that would help people and jump into a flying saucer and take off, and of course the 1957 case of a farmer who was abducted and had sex with an alien woman. That was something that was extremely controversial and was unknown at that time. But as we
The
found out,
Boas case, right?
yeah,
The Boas case. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. He later
Yeah.
became a lawyer, and he stuck to that story right up till the end.
Hmm.
Um, so he wasn't just really just an ignorant farmer. I mean, the guy became a lawyer and highly respected. And somebody in Brazil had told me, yeah, just not long before he passed, he had cancer. He went on television and he repeated that story, to the listening audience from what happened to him in 1957. And of course, now we've heard a lot more such stories over the years. But, you know, I always thought it was interesting that until Bud Hopkins and Whitley Strieber came out with their books, Communion and Intruders, all of a sudden the whole community, UFO community, kind of switched tracks. I mean, before
Hmm.
that, they had some interest, but suddenly they were receiving thousands of pieces of mail from people with experiences. Strieber and Hopkins support groups were, popping up, trying to help these people, and it seemed like Keel, he actually brought attention to the contact. He had written a magazine article at the time, which was very controversially discussed missing time, which was a no-no to a lot of people, and reports of beings, stepping out of the craft, communicating with people. And it was all really because he wrote an article from a True magazine, I think it was, and it was like something like "to hell with the objects, who's flying these things," and he described a few instances of occupant sightings or encounters, and which is what we called them back then. And then afterwards, he's called to the office of the editor of the magazine and says, "Keel, you got some bags of mail over here to pick up in the corner." And they were filled with people who read the article, and quite a number of his stories came out of those bags of mail.
Mm.
Uh, and so anyway, I thought that was real interesting to hear that. Um, but yeah, it's been a slow process of uh, trying to get kind of find out what is actually behind it because of our many people with resistance to the kind of data that emerged,
Hmm.
to effectively deal with it. And really, we need so much a multidisciplinary approach, which is what we're trying to do here, and what Keel and Vallee and Joshua Cutchin and others, kind of often like a lone wolf and trying to figure out what's going on, whereas other people are just even now still ignoring. Because now this a lot of people promoting things they really don't know they just come into the field and they really don't know all the hazards and all the background to these things. But there's still a lot of people resistant to go beyond the nuts and bolts. You hear still a lot about Roswell and all these other crash saucers and government covered ups. And I mean, there's those elements, but there's a lot of other peculiar angles and aspects to all this too. That I keep trying to connect the dots and find those real high, strange, out of place elements, like like we talked about the dead people that suddenly show up and flying saucers, and the doppelganger things, and the poltergeist outbreaks people have had. UFO landing, at their yard, and then maybe the next week somebody sees a Bigfoot behind their house walking across the backyard, and the investigator says, "That's not my department. You need to contact one of those Bigfoot people. I'm just here for your UFO story," And
Yeah. To me, that's
and I interviewed.
it's like the medical field. You go to a specialist now. You have a kidney specialist, you have a heart specialist, you have the cryptid specialist, and you have the UFO people.
Yeah,
But more and more people are developing a kind of a cross dialogue. Again, Keel always thought they were connected. I've always, frankly, thought they were connected. Yeah, back when I wrote that independent study, I thought I was very clever. I thought I was going to invent a new discipline called exoecology. Because I'd read Exopsychology by Timothy Leary, and there was exobiology. I thought that the solution was ecological in nature, that we needed to understand the whole range of beings that we were dealing with. And this was in 1980. So maybe I was a little bit ahead of my time there. I'll take a little credit for that, but I didn't publish anything back then. That was just an independent study that the professor read. He was the only one who read it, probably.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't. I helped. Well, I know you've recently come in contact with Russ Galpone, and I mentioned a colleague of his, Bob Davis, who's a neuroscientist, and I got involved with, trying to help out with the project. Had a lot of Zoom meetings and such from the free organization, Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial Extraordinary Experiences, and they had a survey monkey, and they had several thousand people who responded to it. Detailed questions, yes and no. I think it was like 600 and something questions that people would fill out the form, which could take hours. And then there was less than 100. I can't remember the exact figure of where you actually get to describe certain aspects in detail. And so here were all these several thousand things on SurveyMonkey. I could scroll down through and read these accounts. But we were given an assignment to find, go through each one of us 200 at least, and then out of that maybe pick 2 that we thought that there was a psychologist assigned to looking at, these reports. Then he had some people he had assisting him, but and they did all this, the beyond UFOs, statistical charts and graphs and everything, on all these different type beings and what they were doing, and the messages, and making comparative analysis. And it just sort of told me that there's so many different scenarios and so many different beings. I don't know. It's almost like, is it like an archetypal thing where, they could present themselves? Sometimes they're even reported shape-shifting, where they could be any appearance. I mean, do we really know? Like Rosemary Guiley used to say, who's the Oz behind the curtain here, very, I used to think, well, this is more relevant than just chasing lights in the sky, which I was doing in the early days. But at the same time, a lot of people take it at face value. This is the way they appeared. That's who they were. But I don't know, and I hear all these different places that they come from. The early days of the contactee reports, they were Venus and Mars and so on, and within our solar system. Then, as Jim Moseley pointed out, as one by one, NASA says, no, there's no life on Venus. No, that's very unlikely. It's too hot, and so on. And they gradually seem to move further and further away. But still, even today, we still hear some. But yeah, now they come from impossible places for us to confirm at present, But yeah, and there's always that trickster element to cautiously, consider. So anyway, that's I'm at the point of, I just don't know, but I'm willing to pursue all the different avenues to try to get to it, and I know it's far more complex than a lot of people think. I'm sure of that.
I certainly agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like a Cold War trust but verify kind of approach as far as whatever information that you're getting, whatever they're telling you. I think it's good to have a healthy dose of skepticism, and to some degree look at the effects. There's The free report talks about all the positive changes in people's lives through these contacts. Like 70% of people consider them to be very positive. They would want them to continue. 30% it's either neutral or negative. So their data seems pretty solid to me. I think that there's definitely at least towards human beings, a benevolent aspect to this, but I don't think we can ignore the malevolent aspect either. And the shape-shiftings, again, these are beings that are not, they're not coming to us in physical form. They're manifesting physically. Their appearance may not be who they are in a sense. Just like, I mean, we have souls, I believe. So when we pass on, we leave our physical body. We have a non-physical consciousness. So we could, when we're on the other side, we could probably shapeshift too if we wanted to, or be in multiple places, sort of like Tibetan Buddhist monks can do. I think there's a lot of untapped human potential there, which is a whole nother discussion. But yeah, it's a much more complex phenomena than just the nuts and bolts. That's the least interesting aspect to it. I think there is a technological aspect too, but I think that's in many ways the least interesting, least important to me anyway.
Well, working with the EVP thing, it made me realize that, I was getting intelligent interactive responses. I couldn't tell what the motives necessarily were between wherever this was coming from, but it was there, and for me, it was real. There were too many instances where it was intelligent and interactive, and it shouldn't be, but there it was, and I was, getting the kind of responses that, just regular synchronicity. No, it definitely seemed related exactly. I remember one time I was, we were getting a word. I thought it was Enoch with an O. Some thought it was another being called Enoch with an I. And so I sat around for several minutes doing a private session, and I was asking, is this a being, is this Enoch with an O or an I? And I did this for several minutes, and finally a voice, very clear, said Enoch with an O. And I was like, I was excited. I heard it in real time, and it recorded, and I only left the part on where it said the Enoch with an O. I left out the part where I was like, I think I said, "Holy shit! Okay, thank you." But I should have included that because that's raw human emotion response there. That was just one of those things. It was a full sentence, and it was an answer. Even though my two friends who thought it was with an I still believed that, well, he just told you that. Okay. So irregardless. But yeah, anyway. But we have to test the waters and gather whatever information, evidence from wherever we can get it. I've got a few physical things, but it's just that I've gathered over the years, but it doesn't prove ET. One I've had, it's been analyzed by two different labs. It's just some sand that was heated up to a point where it became crystallized from a landing site in Maine. And then I've got samples of what, years ago in the 60s was very popular space grass. It was this strips of aluminum chaff that, of course, the Air Force had, they had the radar jamming chaff, which this was often confused with, but it was showing up at UFO flight areas and landing sites, and sometimes found just the chaff and it was different lengths apparently than just, what the radar chaff was supposed to be, although they didn't want to give Keel a sample because that was actually something that was supposed to be secret. And one guy down in Alabama that contacted me years ago said he was under surveillance after he sent some that he found somewhere out to be analyzed. Apparently that was a no-no. But mine appear to be different thicknesses and widths, but I got one sample from Stan Gordon, another one from Don Worley in Indiana, and one from Lou Farish in Arkansas. They were showing up at a lot of areas where UFO activity was going on. And Keel always felt that he wrote an article on that years ago, and he always felt it was just deception. It was like this in the military. I think the expression used was crippled submarine effect, or you're just trying to create a false impression that, hey, this came from a UFO, and it's just aluminum chaff. But where was it coming from? Why was it sometimes laying up on a porch or underneath a tree instead of down to the ground with maybe the rope that they would drop with regular radar jamming chaff? When I contacted Keel years later to discuss it with him, he said, I live in this tiny apartment in New York City. I had a map from the Air Force that said where all these places they drop the chaff were, but I don't have room in my small apartment, so I just threw it away. I said, oh, darn.
It sounds like Keel. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, that article will be in the June issue of Alternate Perceptions, and on Robert Steiner that you wrote, and all your interesting ideas on that. And also, after June is over and we go into July, it'll still be on the site in archive, and people can still look it up. You can still look it up, and it'll be available for reading for years to come. So anyway,
sounds good. Thank you.
So, I thank you. I find your ideas very interesting, and it's just it's interesting how we're all trying to understand this better, and a lot of us are following along a similar pathways, but finding different ways of kind of like very few have really pursued the Steiner material on this. I certainly I've heard of him, but I haven't really delved into it like you had, and these other areas as well. And it just kind of, like you say, it's along a similar path with others like Vallee and Keel, who really first drew our attention to some of these high strange shenanigans. So anyway, so I guess if there is no further areas that you want to explore, any final things you'd like to say on the subject,
I think this was great. Thank you for having me. Maybe we can do it again sometime.
Okay.
That would be nice. But
well, I appreciate you. Let me go ahead and post your article. I think it was like 8 pages, and have this good discussion here on all these different aspects. I think we've almost got it solved now, don't we?
Well, that'll be the day. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it's interesting to question and challenge it all, and I don't know, but they may not come up with the answer during our lifetime, but somewhere down the road, hopefully. Anyway,
well, we may know more when we're on the other side. That's what I think. But I'm in no hurry to get there.
I'm not even. But there are more and more over there now. Than they got Keel and many others. So, all right then. Well, take care of yourself, and
you too.
Stay in touch, and we'll do this again sometime. And be looking forward to your other future writing efforts here. So,
yeah, I'll send them along to you for sure. You take care.
All right. Thank you. We'll see you later.
Yep.